still thinking about fundamentals and fundamentalism. Not so much that it exists as a kind of social phenomena, but while we use a word like fundamentals or fundamentalists, what metaphorical structure, what analogical structure of thought we're alluding to with that. Because we are, and and how we can understand ourselves and that metaphor better, really. And what I've been trying to figure out is not exactly the opposite, but just a kind of counter term, and I haven't really been able to find one that's different. So I've been looking, to help me with that, I've been looking at a kind of other instances which have some resonance for that for me. I'll see if I can explain what I mean by that. One of the person who writes the most in this area is a guy called George Lakoff, who I've talked about before, and he's quite well known. And he works in the field of cognitive linguistics and embodied cognition, all this stuff about the really vital role that metaphor and analogy plays in human thought and understanding. He's one of the key players in that. One of the things he does is he writes about the use of metaphor and analogy in political thought, particularly how we understand governance and authority, because these things are really complex ideas and they're abstract ideas, aren't they? You know, what a political party is, what our relationship to its tenets are, all that kind of stuff. It's really abstract. So in line with Lakoff's sort of ideas, what he would say we do is that we understand those abstract complex ideas by metaphorizing them into something that we do understand, something that's concrete, something that is from our personal experience. And so when he's talking about the political parties in the States, for example, the Democratic and the Republican parties, he says that one of the major metaphors that we use for understanding those parties and their differences is by a series of metaphors coming out of parenting. He says we tend to see government as if it's a parent, and you see that a lot, don't you? I mean, that permeates a lot of our language. We see government as if it's a kind of parent, and different political parties play the role of different kinds of parents, he says. And we react to them in terms of what kind of parent they are, and they shape themselves and their advertising and their behaviours according to what kind of parent they are. And he breaks it down into two major forms, one for the Democrats and one for the Republicans. The Republicans, he says, fulfil the role of a parent which is like a strict father. Strict father, he says. Quite authoritarian, quite rigid, quite not exactly emotionless, but certainly valuing a detachment, quite rule-based, definitely hierarchical, definitely a coercive force. You know, it's a rule by law, a rule by the stick, and a lot of concerns for things like purity, or like the maintenance of boundaries and borders. It has all that kind of sense to it, and that's obviously that produces stereotypes, and in many ways is a stereotype. But you know, I guess for many of us, we would feel some kind of a recognition of a certain kind of governmental style in that, particularly a right-wing governmental style, like the Republican Party in the States, and maybe the Conservative Party here or something like it. He contrasts that with how he sees the Democratic Party, what kind of a parent they would be. And he says they're more like nurturant parent. Now, it sounds like I'm putting a lot of pejorative emphasis on republicanism and positive emphasis on the Democrats, but maybe I am. And I think George Lakoff to a certain extent does, but he puts it on far less than I am. He's just pointing out the distinctions. But the nurturant parent, the one that he talks about in terms of the Democrats, it's not exactly female. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it's tempting to think of the Republicans as a strict father and the Democrats as a nurturing mother, but that's not what he says. He says it's the nurturant parent, and the nurturant parent isn't gendered in anything like the same way. But the way they act in the world is more associated with how we would see females, but it isn't actually femaled, and as I say, gendered and like that. It's more to do with nurturing, obviously, as the thing goes. But rather than there being kind of an emphasis on firmness and rigidity and rules and structure and boundaries. There's an emphasis on more kind of organic relationships. So it would be to do with connection, negotiation, conversation, bringing out rather than whipping in. Yeah, it's all to do with that. And you can just the terms like bringing out as opposed to whipping in is significant in that gendered sense too, isn't it? So he makes those kind of concepts, and he makes a good argument. Obviously, these are metaphors, analogical structures. They are real in the way that metaphors and myths and that kind of structure is real, not necessarily in a physical way. But nevertheless, this, as he says, is how we. Sorry, I put my dog lead on. This is how we organise a lot of our thought. This is how we come to understand things. One of these ways. So I'm just thinking how that relates to some of the stuff I've spoken about in relation to particularly fundamentalism, I suppose. Got the dog coming up. Come on, peeps. Hi there. But, anyway, what I'm thinking about there is because I'm trying to get to is this idea that that fundamentals, that there's a metaphorical structure, just as Lakoff says there's a metaphorical structure with wine. Just as Lakoff says there's a metaphorical structure by which we come to understand governance, and then there's variations in that. Governance is a family, and within that there are different family relationships: strict parent, nurturing parent, strict father, nurturing parent. So I'm thinking that one of the ways in which we understand something like belief, knowledge, truth, that kind of thing, is through this metaphorical idea to do with a kind of structure, a kind of building that has foundations and that has fundamentals. And if you're a fundamentalist, you will have a particular affiliation with, an attraction to the fundamentals. Now, it may be that those fundamentals are kind of scientifically true. Right now I'm not talking about the validity of those fundamentals, I'm just talking about the structure of thought. But if you're a fundamentalist, you will have a particular attraction to those, what you see as deeper underlying structures, what you'll see as properly basic, what you will see as foundational, what you'll see as lying at the root of your beliefs, on which your beliefs are built, all those kind of things. It's a structuring, building metaphor that's permeating your understanding, and all of our understanding, not just you particularly. But if you're a fundamentalist, as I say, you will have an attraction to the basement. You will spend that time down there, looking at the foundations, arguing for the validity of the foundations. You know, whether, as I say, those be religious or other kinds of foundations for your beliefs and knowledge. And you'll probably spend less time up in the airy-fairy scaffolding that's on the top of the building. In fact, you might even be dismissive of those who do spend their time up there. Just a couple of examples of that. There are many in the religious communities, for example, fundamentalist religious people who are attracted to the literal truth, and they will use a word like truth a lot, spend their time in the basement quite a lot, hanging on to the properly foundational ideas that are in the Bible and so on. But they will be quite condemnatory of religious people who spend their time up in the windy and more unstable areas higher up the building. You know, they will see these as not real Christians, or as airy-fairy Christians, or something like that. People who are theists, or kind of believers, but spend their time up in the sky, they will, as I said, they'll be dismissive of that. And similarly in scientific communities, it's very common in, for example, in people who are doing physics, to be quite dismissive of people who are doing other kinds of sciences, particularly the social sciences, but even something like chemistry. I listen to a radio show called The Infinite Monkey Cage, and Brian Cox, the physicist, is on there quite a bit. And there's an ongoing joke he's got about chemistry, where he refers to chemists as Delia, after a well-known TV chef, TV cook, because he compared chemistry to a kind of cookery, as opposed to the really hard stuff of physics. And when he says it's the hard sciences, he's identifying that as those as foundational, which I guess we would all be reasonably happy with. But then he's making a kind of statement of allegiance to that hardness and the foundational things. He wants to spend his time down there looking at the hard facts of physics, which is fine, but it's simultaneously quite dismissive of the much softer and more gaseous and less easily pinned down ideas that occupy the other sciences. So again, it's the same kind of thing. Okay, so just to reiterate here, what I want to do is I just want to stay with fundamentalism and the idea that fundamentalism, as we understand it, is part of a larger metaphorical structure by which all of us, in some ways, at various times, come to understand what that nest of ideas called knowledge is, or belief, or doubt, all that stuff to do with epistemology. And we understand it as a kind of a building, and the building has a foundation, and it's got this stuff at the top which is much more wobbly and shaky. And then within that overall metaphor, which we all share, there's different takes on it, with fundamentalists spending their time down at the bottom. And I'm paralleling this, and I think it might be more than just a parallel, with Lakoff's metaphorical reading of governance, in which government is seen as a kind of family, and the relationship of individuals to government are parent-child relationships. And within that, there are those who conform to an idea of parenting in which it realises itself as strict father, and others who realise it as nurturant parent. If there's possibly a correlation, if I was going to make a hypothesis out of this, I would say, is there a correlation between those who adopt the strict parent model, strict parent metaphor of governance, i.e. who vote Republican, let's say, and people who adopt fundamentalist relationships to knowledge? And conversely, is there a relationship between those who adopt a more nurturant parent model within their political understandings, i.e. who tend to vote Democrat, and those who are not fundamentalists, who spend their time, in terms of their epistemological inquiries, their understanding of what they know, who spend their time in the much less certain, much more airy-fairy, elevated spaces, well above the foundations, well above the fundamentals. Anyway, that's kind of what I'm thinking of right now. Thank you.